Great. Hello, welcome. My name is Lindsay Ryder, and I'm a volunteer board member with Gallatin Refugee Connections. We're a 501c3 nonprofit volunteer-led organization based here in Bozeman. And we've been around since 2016 when we were founded by a group of concerned community members who wanted to create a vehicle for action regarding their concern around the plight of refugees. So just real quickly about me. So I'm from Bozeman. I was born and raised here and moved back here 7 years ago after spending some time around the country and around the world, really, including attending law school and having the chance to work with refugees in that capacity. And when I moved back home, I was very keenly aware of moving back to to my community, right? But a very different community than those I'd been interacting with in my time around the world, and felt really hungry to connect with fellow community members who shared a similarly kind of worldly and justice-oriented view as me. And so I found that in my work with Gallatin Refugee Connections, and have been really honored to be a participant in our volunteer-led work these past few years. And just real quickly, the mission of GRC, again, we're a volunteer-led nonprofit organization, is to build and sustain a welcoming environment for refugees and beyond in the Montana and Gallatin Valley area. And I am honored to be here presenting this Refugee 101 presentation in partnership with the Pilgrim UU congregation. And this presentation is being recorded so that we can share it out with folks and they can learn and engage on their own time. And thanks to those of you for joining us today. So again, here's Gallatin Refugee's mission statement. And we do a variety of community education and engagement events to further our mission. And then one exciting event that we have held annually since 2017, I believe, with a pause on 2020, but we're excited to be offering the community again this month on March 27th. We're holding our annual welcome kit drive, where we secure donations of household goods that are then packed up and shipped over to Missoula, which is indeed a refugee resettlement site, the only one here in Montana for now. And these donations, these welcome kits, help resettled families and individuals who have come here as refugees to establish themselves in their new lives in Montana. And so I welcome you to reach out to us if you are interested in participating in the Welcome Kit Drive. Again, it's happening March 27th, and you can find out more information on GRC's Facebook page or our website at gallatinrefugeeconnections.org. So today I just wanted to spend a few minutes to talk about a little bit of the background, the legal infrastructure and global context behind refugees, and then zoom in a little bit about refugees here in Montana. As I mentioned, Missoula is indeed a refugee resettlement site. And so I can share a little bit more about what our neighbors in Missoula are doing to welcome refugees. So first, the fun stuff. I mentioned I am a lawyer. Don't tell anyone else. And refugees are, the status of refugees is an internationally and domestically afforded legal status. It's a legal protection based on international human rights law, of which the US is a signatory to. And then the US has its own domestic and federal in scope legal infrastructure that dictates how we treat refugees, essentially. So I also say that to acknowledge that that can change, right? Like laws can be amended. Certain people didn't used to be able to get married until recently. Women weren't allowed to have credit cards in their own name until the 1970s. Laws change and the rights of individuals shift accordingly. So this is kind of a current snapshot, more or less in layman's language, of of who a refugee is at this point in time under the legal definition, and that can change. So I'll just read this. Refugees are people who have fled persecution and can no longer return home because of a fear of persecution on account of their race, religion, gender, political opinions, or membership in a particular social group. And so that comes from the United Nations Conventions relating to the status of refugees. And that is the international legal framework that determines who is a refugee and who is not. So we flag here that, so this means that most refugees are those fleeing violence or some form of chaos in their country of origin. That can change based on kind of the social group that the individual belongs to and whether that social group is being persecuted in their country of origin. For example, members of the LGBTQ community in a certain country might be persecuted as such. We also flag here that in the future, many people may be fleeing the effects of climate change. That is not a specifically recognized condition for an individual to be determined a refugee at this point in time. However, we anticipate that that will change, and we are already certainly witnessing global migration shifts related to climate change. A little bit more about the legal background, because I think it's really important and helpful. I might just be partial as a nerdy lawyer, but so the refugee system and the legal system was really developed in post-World War II plans coming out of Europe. And basically the international community recognized that there were thousands and thousands of people fleeing persecution following the aftermath of two world wars in a row, really. And seeking safe haven and an opportunity to work and rebuild their lives. And that was the genesis of the international refugee legal system. In the 1980s, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees began building refugee camps as a temporary solution. So that was just in the 80s. And that's when I came to be in existence on this planet. And I can tell you, I have moved dozens and dozens of times around the country, around the world in my lifetime. And so these, what were designed to be temporary solutions of refugee camps, have become permanent realities for hundreds of thousands of people around the world. They are living in conditions that weren't intended to sustain life in any form of dignified existence for a long period of time. There are intergenerational families who have had new generations of children that the only life they know is in a refugee camp, where they're provided minimal shelter and food. They're not allowed to travel or work. And basically the ability of these people and these families to move out of the system is dependent on third countries who allow for resettlement, like the United States and so many others around the world. So who are refugees? Where do they come from? How do they get here? I mentioned the US is one of several countries that resettle refugees. And then how do they get to Montana, right? And why Missoula? Why not Bozeman? We'll talk about some of these things. And let me just pause one moment here. I'm realizing I'm not sure I'm easily able to see if folks are chatting in any questions. So if you do have a question, please come off mute so I can be sure to notice. So this is shocking. We all know 113 people. Current statistics indicate that 1 in every 113 people on our planet is an asylum seeker, and that is an internally displaced person. Still in their country of origin, but having left whatever community they existed in because they're fleeing persecution or fear of persecution, or actually has been designated as a refugee under the international legal framework. It's a massive amount of people on this planet. And here's kind of to zoom out and give you scale. So that's 26 million people worldwide who qualify as refugees. 1.4 million of those refugees need resettlement. I like to think of that as it's 1.4 million souls who are, have fled their homes, fearing for their lives. But that kind of puts that figure in scale, like 1.4 million, that's something we can, as a global society, work with, right? Like we have the means to help these folks out. Forward a little bit. 85% of refugees are hosted in developing regions of the globe. So these aren't, the individuals who have been designated as refugees who are getting resettled to Germany or the United States. They're actually being hosted, whether in refugee camps or even resettlement programs, to developing regions. So again, I say that with emphasis about the reality that as a global society, if developing countries are able to make it work to resettle refugees and help support them to establish new lives, I think a country like the United States should be more than able to, right? That's my editorial commentary there. If any of you follow GRC on Facebook, we posted something for International Women's Day last week. Most refugees are women and children, and just over half of refugees are women and girls. So it gives you a sense of who is living in these camps, who is in need of resettlement and a durable solution for the rest of their lives, and who is fleeing persecution, being forced to leave their home. And where do they come from? So this is as of 2016 data from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So not every single country has the conditions that would warrant individuals to flee for fear of persecution. So there's a concentration of countries that refugees are coming from. And again, as of 2016, this may have shifted a little bit. Actually, I know one data point where this has shifted, but so South Sudan remains a significant country of origin for driving refugees, those fleeing persecution, Afghanistan, Syria, and then I know Venezuela in more recent years, there's been an uptick because of the economic and political collapse there. And then this is refugees globally, right? And then in the United States, we are resettling refugees. And again, this is across the country, not necessarily in Montana, but we're resettling refugees mainly from the Democratic Republic of Congo, from Burma, from Ukraine, and from Bhutan. Those are the top countries as of 2018. So what are the options? You're forced to flee your home because of actual persecution or a well-founded fear of persecution. You find yourself in a refugee camp, just trying to stay alive. So what are your options? The international legal framework allows for these options. One is to wait things out until this persecution or fear of persecution from which you fled is no longer an issue and you're able to return home. That is very rare. Sometimes the option is to become integrated into the country that you fled to if you fled beyond your own country's borders. Only the minority of individuals who flee their country and are kind of in this legal framework are actually resettled to third countries. And some of that reasoning behind this just being a minority of people that are resettled to third countries is time. Like it can take years, decades even, for them to kind of work through the system and be vetted and actually be allowed to be resettled. In a lot of cases, the international community's hope is that refugees can be given safe haven in a neighboring country where there's more of a shared culture or language or religion, and or a hope that they could eventually return to their home country. So that's kind of the incentive there. And then the sad reality is that many refugees actually don't even end up in camps. They end up kind of working in underground economies to survive, flee to a neighboring country, and kind of operate under the radar really, and aren't able to partake in some of the safe haven offerings that countries of resettlement are able to offer. So who is hosting them? This is where are that minority of refugees who do get resettled to a third country, where do they end up? So here's a map. So I mentioned the 85% of host countries are developing. So Bangladesh, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Lebanon, Sudan, Jordan, Uganda, Colombia, and Germany. These are the highest refugee host countries. The US is certainly not on this list. So what is the difference between refugees and asylum seekers, right? So this is where the legal framework is admittedly quite unclear for most people. So don't feel embarrassed if you don't know the answer to this question. That's the point of this presentation and this opportunity to learn, right? So basically, an asylum seeker is an individual who is seeking the status of a refugee, but hasn't been legally determined to hold the context to be granted refugee status yet. So it's kind of like a process, right? So an asylum seeker is an individual who has fled their country of origin because they have been persecuted or have been subject to a well-founded fear of persecution and are fleeing for their life or safety. And this is kind of like an example of what that looks like for maybe one individual. They could flee to the US, and once they're in the US, they can apply for asylum here. So they're seeking asylum. They're seeking determination of their status as a refugee. They have 1 year upon arriving to the US to apply for asylum. And during that waiting period, which can take years, they are granted no benefits, no kind of special support or protections, really. They're kind of required to operate on their own. And they move through a kind of protracted vetting and determination process. And if they are deemed to qualify as a refugee under the legal framework, then they're granted asylum and have refugee status, and are then afforded certain protections and rights and support accordingly. I'll draw your attention to that third bullet point, that the individual, I'll say biases or just prerogatives of, admittedly, human beings are not neutral people, but the approval rates for determining whether an individual meets the standards to be a refugee and be granted protections as such vary greatly, actually, among specific judges, have track records. The legal officials who make these determinations some have track records of having higher approval rates, and some have track records of having lower approval rates. There's also kind of in geographies around the country. If you're an asylum and your legal process is handled in, I think, Texas versus New York, your likelihood of being granted refugee status is lower. So just interesting how, despite this well-established legal framework, that individual bias plays a role. There's also a huge backlog of cases of folks who are trying to have their refugee status determined, who are kind of just operating in this purgatory right now. So here's an interesting chart. You can see a trend here. Ooh, falls off. So I mentioned in 1980, that's when the United States domestic legal refugee legal framework was established. And at that point in time, the admissions ceiling, meaning the annual cap or maximum of refugees that the United States was able to admit, was set at close to 240,000, maybe 235,000 or so. And that's the blue dot on the top. The orange shows the actual number of refugees admitted for each year. So you can see a precipitous decline, kind of bottoms out in the early 2000s and then tanks in recent years. So every year, the president holds the authority to establish this cap, which then determines how many refugees can be admitted for resettlement in the US. It's totally arbitrary. It's totally up to the president's discretion. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the world. If there's a war in Syria, if there's a famine in Ethiopia, you would think the president would take those factors into consideration when establishing a cap. And I think most administrations have and do, but they don't have to. And yeah, another couple important points on this slide is that across history, the US's resettlement of refugees has been an extremely across the aisle bipartisan effort and had support, bipartisan support. Both Democratic and Republican presidents have kind of maintained a certain admissions cap across the years for the most part. The number of admitted refugees has fluctuated more greatly, that orange line you can see, and that's because of things like administrative backlog or the fact that other countries have stepped up and are accepting more resettled refugees, or that there hasn't been as great of need. Unfortunately, in the later 2000s, global resettlement needs were skyrocketing while the United States admissions cap was plummeting to historic lows. You could see that we'd never set caps that low, anywhere near that low since the existence of the resettlement program. Oh, and I don't want to add here that President Biden has made commitments to establish an admissions cap of 125,000 refugees to resettle in the US. And that should take place in October of this year. And that 125 cap would be good for that federal fiscal year. So that's kind of reinstating us to more proximate historic norms. So here's just a little diagram of the resettlement process. So the different agencies that individuals or families move through along the journey of being determined to be a refugee and being able to be established in a country of resettlement where they can start a new life. We'll talk through this a little bit. So I mentioned a vetting process, and this can take years. There can also be massive amounts of human bias imparted during the process. I actually applied to be a DHS resettlement officer after law school. I was really interested in this process, and based on some of the work I did on appeals of asylum claims. So individuals who did not successfully make their case at the DHS screening stage, but had a viable claim. I was able to work with them and develop and issue appeals and actually get them refugee status. So it just goes to show that even though everyone's reading the same laws, technically applying the same laws. The facts that you present and the story you tell and the individual that hears them and makes that decision can inform how that decision falls. So yeah, this is kind of just a little chart of the process. It's extremely intensive, can take several years. I thought I had noted the average. So it looks like the average is around 18 months. And I like to share this data point. So Mayor Wilmot Collins in Helena is a refugee, and his vetting process took 2 years and 7 months. I mentioned a bit about the fluctuation of approval rates and kind of how that can be a window for bias. And so this is across the years since 2001, the kind of number of asylum applications granted versus those denied. So the granted in green remaining largely steady and the percentage denied increasing. I mentioned that the top country of origin for refugees resettled to the US is the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I just wanted to include this slide that shows individuals from the DRC and just share a little bit about the background so you can get a sense of how and why folks are fleeing. So the Congo has become a never-ending nightmare. It's one of the bloodiest conflicts since World War II, with millions being killed. And this is the biggest country in sub-Saharan Africa. And on paper, it's extremely wealthy with tons of natural resources like copper and diamonds and gold, farmlands, fertile farmlands, hydropower. But it's also one of the poorest. I've heard the word hopeless nations on earth. So just to give you a sense of, the context, it's complicated. These folks could have opportunity in their homeland. I'm sure would want to have opportunity in their homeland, but are forced to flee. Eritreans in a refugee camp. So these are individuals who have fled and are living in a refugee camp. It's possible that that these children may have been born in this refugee camp and lived there for many years. I actually worked with an Eritrean individual, asylum seeker, while I was in law school, and was very honored to develop an appeal for their asylum claim. They were initially denied asylum. They had fled to Hong Kong and were denied asylum there. And I was able to develop an appeal that granted them refugee status, and they were able to be permanently resettled in Hong Kong and start their new life there. So that was a really powerful experience. And so what about Montana? What about the folks who don't go to a refugee camp and stay there forever or go to Hong Kong? How do refugees get to Montana? So if an individual is one of the fortunate ones to have their claim approved, be granted refugee status, and be assigned resettlement to a third country, they don't choose if they have family who has been resettled to a specific place. That will certainly inform and increase the likelihood that that individual or their family would also be resettled. Also, the resettlement process is designed to allow for refugees from the same country or same community who share language and culture, religion, all of those things, to be resettled in the same area so that they can have a sense of community. And studies show that greatly increases their ability to thrive in establishing their new life. I just got notification from Zoom that we have more than 40 minutes. They granted a gift to my free Zoom account, so we can take a little bit more time and go up to the 1 o'clock hour without as much concern. Just wanted to share that good news. So what happens when these individuals learn that they have been granted resettlement and that they're being resettled to Montana. So they will literally be put on a plane, whether an individual, if they're alone, or their families. Oftentimes it is families or couples, women and children, right? Who will be put on a plane and will land in Missoula and be greeted by their caseworker. That family or that refugee will have 3 months of case management, which is supported by one of 9 designated international agencies. And the agency that plays that role in Missoula is the International Rescue Committee of Missoula. There's also a partner nonprofit in Missoula called Soft Landing Missoula, which is not one of the 9 recognized resettlement agencies. Rather, they are a community-based nonprofit that provides supplemental support to new and established refugees who have been resettled to Montana. So those individuals will have 3 months of case management. And then after that, they're supposed to be self-sufficient. So that's kind of crazy. And that's why entities like Soft Landing are really important, like GRC and the Welcome Kit Drive that we're holding are really important, because there's a lot of supplemental support that these individuals and families need beyond what is the bare legal minimum. So after 1 year, the refugee can apply for legal status and they'll receive a green card. And then after 5 years, they are able to apply for citizenship and have kind of full rights and abilities as any US citizen. So even though they come to Montana, the game's not over, right? There's still a lot of help that's needed and a lot of hoops to jump through. So again, who helps them? And sorry, this slide's a little pixelated. So the State Refugee Services Office, and we have a Montana Refugee Statewide Network that is a loose affiliation of nonprofits or other community organizations that in some way provide support, either direct support and or advocacy for refugees in the state. I mentioned the IRC of Missoula, who is the federally designated resettlement agency and service provider, and then supported by community efforts like Soft Landing Missoula, like Gallatin Refugee Connections, like other community entities, other faith-based or otherwise in the Missoula area that offer support in various forms to the individuals being resettled there. So, I mean, what do they do, right? Besides learn English, figure out, the vast majority of these folks are coming from warmer climates, figure out how to live in Montana's climate, and they have to work, right? They have 3 months of casework support where they have some very, very modest financial support, but they need to participate in the economy. So in Missoula, a lot of the refugees who have been resettled there work in the service industries, including hotels, restaurants, and retail. Some of them have employment serving as interpreters for the International Rescue Committee. And then there's, Montana is a pretty entrepreneurial place, I think. And I think that refugees are also very entrepreneurial. And we have examples of refugees in Missoula who have started their own businesses, and including like a small catering company and hiring others to work for him. There was a report released a couple years ago talking about the economic contributions of immigrants and refugees in Montana, which was really amazing and powerful to see. Actually, I talked about the very modest support that they are provided to help them get established. They end up, if you want to get super capitalistic about it, the ROI on investing in refugees is high. They end up being very high contributors to our economy. They also are very high contributors to our culture. Missoula hosts a soccer competition every year. I'll let you guess who wins. We actually, Gallatin Refugee hosted a really fun event a couple years ago as well, where we invited some of our refugee friends from Missoula to come give a performance. It was a screening of short documentaries that some folks had made. And then this one family who, it's like a family rock band, are amazing. They're from the Democratic Republic of Congo, performed at the Rialto downtown. It was really fun. But it's not all song and dance. There's issues with the resettlement infrastructure and everything it entails. So what are some of those problems? So the United Nations Refugee Agency has no permanent funding. And then the US funding and our admissions ceiling is very unpredictable. You saw the chart where it, wavered around, spiked, plummeted. So our communities around the United States who are resettling refugees and welcoming refugees into their community, it's a very unpredictable role for them to play because their ability to do that is dictated by these factors. And then zooming out more globally, again, these refugee camps that were built and designed with the intention to be temporary holdovers have become permanent, with intergenerational families living decades in these really subpar conditions. A solution that could be partially addressed by more robust resettlement options, which is dependent on those countries to establish resettlement potential for refugees to come to those countries. Also, a lot of refugees, I mentioned, will flee to, whether within their country or to neighboring regions, to urban areas, and kind of operate kind of under the radar in Black market economies, and don't have that support to really help learn a language and become a part of the community in a meaningful way. And then also just the global context. Not all of this is just what's happening over there. If you look back in time, the United States plays a significant role, has played a significant role in setting up situations and contexts which lead to the conditions that individuals are then fleeing from. So for example, our involvement in Central American conflict in the 80s, where we were arming folks in Nicaragua, like that is a direct example of ways the United States has involvement in international contexts that then lead to individuals in those regions needing to flee for their lives. And so it's this loop, right? Like we're part of this circle, and just to think of refugees as people who are experiencing plight over there and we need to support them. That's true, and it's also, I think, really important to think in the bigger picture, like what was the United States or other countries, other political powers involvement in creating those conditions, right? And then climate change, it's same story, like it's not something that's just happening. There's reasons why it's happening, and what can we do about those factors that are creating the conditions for folks needing to flee and enter into this refugee system. And then also, what can we do about supporting them and giving them new opportunity in our country? In the interest of time, I'm probably gonna skip this slide. It is pretty important though. It's kind of related to just global migration contexts and some things I was alluding to about, what the United States role is in an international context, and how that plays out at our borders, and kind of who finds themselves at our borders fleeing persecution and seeking new opportunity and support, why they are there, and what the United States involvement has been, whether directly or tangentially, in creating the conditions for them to arrive at our borders. So let's talk about some of the solutions. So predictability, right? If communities like Missoula and the people who go to work, and the organizations they work for have some sort of predictability as to how many refugees they can plan for, have predictability in the budgets that they use to support their resettlement and pay their salaries and make that happen. That's part of the solution. And this is, again, we want to have solutions for resettlement, and we also want to have solutions for alleviating conditions that lead to the need for folks fleeing their country of origin. So how does international development influence that, both for countries' ability to offer resettlement, as well as the context in countries that develop conditions that folks are fleeing? And same thing, I talked about learning English and building a life here, and what are opportunities to support refugees who are able to actually or potentially rebuild a life in their country of origin should conditions permit eventually. And then, so what does this mean for you? So that's kind of like the system, and then at the individual level. So what can you do? I think I love to use this quadruple A framework that was developed by Dr. Barbara Love: awareness, then to analysis, then to action, and then to accountability. So we're all here, we're building our awareness and analysis, essentially becoming informed about refugees and the system they're operating in. And then share your knowledge with others. Make sure folks kind of understand the context and the need and the solutions. If you want to move to action, you can donate to International Rescue Committee or Soft Landing Missoula. Those would be our first preferences for donation. GRC does have hard costs associated with the welcome kit drive we're holding. So if you are interested in donating to GRC, you can email us at gallatinrefugees@gmail.com, and we can talk about that. And volunteer with us. Whether you want to work with us to host a conversation with your friends or social group or faith group or whatever to deepen others' awareness and analysis on refugees, or if you want to support the kit drive, you need volunteers for that to make that happen. And then advocate. So encourage reform in the system to make it more, this is supposed to say humane, scale it up, and make the system reflective of shifting conditions, whether in the US or globally. So that brings us to about a minute before the hour. And so I welcome folks to go off mute and share any comments or questions in these last moments we have together. And thank you so much for joining and listening, whether live or the recording. And looking forward to engaging you as you continue to build your awareness, analysis, action, and accountability in support of this.
Thank you, Lindsay. Dee Dee or Emily, before you have to go back to work or wherever the rest of your day is, do you have questions? I have a question, but I can certainly wait.
I don't. This was really helpful and informative, and I'm going to go to the website, and I'm sure I'll find out what I need to know about the drive there. And thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for joining and just for your interest and your willingness to participate in developing our awareness together, right?
Yep. So important.
Well, my question, Lindsay, is I recently watched a film called God Grew Tired of Us, and it was about refugee resettlement. And this isn't meant as a criticism, but just a concern, and your thoughts about it is once refugees are resettled into communities, how do they prevent mental health issues and loneliness from being pulled out of their culture?
Yes, absolutely. And first, that is like a very powerful and provocative film title, Marcy. And yeah, no, that's so real. I mentioned that an individual doesn't get to choose where they're resettled to, if they're resettled at all. They're not buying a ticket to go on vacation, right? Like this. But if there is kind of an established community, I mentioned in Missoula, for example, folks from the Congo, I think in Syria are two of the main communities that have been resettled there. So it's intentionally designed to create communities of shared culture and experience and religion and identity to help support folks along those lines. But I think, I don't care how good the conditions are and how well they're set up for success in their community of resettlement. Like they've experienced trauma that I don't even want to understand the depths of, right? And so having these community agencies that take resources, so that's how, if you think about how you want to do your own personal giving, like I'm a donor to the Help Center, I'm a donor to Bridger Clinic, for example. So these community agencies that are able to offer that type of really critical support, whether mental health or physical health and integrated systems like that. Yeah, and then I'll also just say in my personal experience, after college in New York City, I volunteered with a program at the NYU Medical Center called the Program for Survivors of Torture. And I worked specifically with one individual who was a refugee from Cameroon and was a survivor of torture. And I worked in the volunteer capacity as an English tutor. And I was, as part of my training, given very clear restrictions around not engaging with this individual about their trauma and their history, because they wanted to be just super thoughtful about the realities of that experience and keep the professionals in charge of navigating that with that individual. So yeah, it's scary and it's real. And I think that those types of community supports that are dependent on volunteers and donations are really critical. Any other questions or reflections or curiosities? Maybe we can wrap it with that. And again, I'll just flag for folks, March 27th, Saturday, March 27th, 2021, Welcome Kit Drive. If you know Marty on the line here, he's your man, holding it all down. Literally, it would not happen without him. And so you can reach out to him or email us at gallatinrefugees@gmail.com to learn more. And thanks again for joining. And thanks, Marcy, for hosting.
And thank you very much, Lindsay, for presenting.
Yeah.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye.